There are moments in history when the machinery of justice grinds to a halt, not because it has failed, but because someone within its grasp forces it to confront its own contradictions. In the late summer of 1993, inside a Washington state courtroom, a man sat calmly before a judge and made a request that would reverberate through legal circles for years to come. He didn't ask for mercy. He didn't proclaim innocence. Instead, he asked to die. Not in the abstract sense of accepting punishment, but specifically, methodically, by hanging. The state had already abolished that method of execution years earlier, but this man knew the law better than most. He knew that those sentenced before a certain date still had the choice, and he was determined to exercise it. His name was Wesley Allen Dodd, and by the time he made that request, the things he had done had already carved a permanent scar across the Pacific Northwest. But what makes his story linger in the darker corners of criminology isn't just the crimes themselves, it's the meticulous self-awareness with which he documented them, the chilling honesty he displayed about his own compulsions, and the uncomfortable questions his case raised about whether certain people can ever truly be rehabilitated, or whether some part of the human psyche can become so fundamentally altered that redemption becomes impossible. This is not a story about shock or spectacle. It is a story about patterns recognized too late, warning signs dismissed, and a system that moved slowly while a quiet, unassuming man moved with terrible purpose through the shadows of suburban parks and playgrounds. It is about the parents who let their children ride bikes to the park on warm September evenings, never imagining that someone was watching, waiting, calculating. And it is about the final, strange act of a man who seemed to want the world to understand him, even as he ensured that understanding would come too late to matter. Welcome to True Crime Headquarters. This evening, we uncover disturbing cases where the truth lurked far beneath a harmless surface. Now, please take a moment to settle in. Breathe slowly. Let the outside world fade. This is the story of the man who chose the gallows. Now, let's begin. Wesley Allen Dodd was born on July 3, 1961, in Toppenish, Washington, a small agricultural town in the Yakima Valley where vast orchards stretched beneath the shadow of the Cascade Mountains. His early childhood, by most external measures, appeared unremarkable. His father worked as a shipping clerk, his mother tended to the household, and Wesley was the oldest of 3 children in a family that attended church and participated in community life. But beneath the surface of this ordinary American childhood, something was quietly, persistently wrong. Please, if you enjoy listening and would like to find this channel again, you're welcome to subscribe. Those who study the development of violent sexual offenders often point to a constellation of factors rather than a single cause. Early exposure to inappropriate sexual material, disrupted attachment patterns, experiences of humiliation or powerlessness, and crucially, early behavioral indicators that go unaddressed. In Dodd's case, he would later recall with unsettling precision that his sexual interests became fixated on children when he was himself still a child, around 13 years old. He began exposing himself to children in his neighborhood, an act that brought him a sense of power and control he felt nowhere else in his life. These incidents were sporadic at first, but they established a pattern that would define the next 2 decades. His parents divorced when Dodd was 15, a rupture that seemed to accelerate his isolation. He was described by those who knew him as quiet, somewhat awkward, the kind of boy who faded into the background of school hallways and family gatherings. He struggled to form meaningful connections with peers his own age, and his academic performance was inconsistent. After graduating from high school, he enlisted in the U.S. Navy in 1981, perhaps hoping, as many young men do, that military structure would provide direction or purpose. Instead, it became another setting where his compulsions manifested. While stationed at the Bangor submarine base near Silverdale, Washington, Dodd began molesting children who lived in the on-base housing area. He would later admit to numerous incidents during this period, though the full scope was never completely documented. In 1982, after being caught in one such incident, he was discharged from the Navy. The discharge was relatively quiet, the kind of administrative separation that allowed him to slip back into civilian life without significant public record or consequence. This would become a recurring theme. Dodd would be caught, there would be some response from authorities, and then he would move on, the system failing to recognize or adequately address the escalating danger he represented. Throughout the 1980s, Dodd drifted through a series of jobs and living situations across Washington state. He worked in factories, in shipping warehouses, in positions that required minimal social interaction and allowed him to remain largely invisible. He molested children whenever opportunity presented itself, sometimes in his own apartment when he babysat neighbors' children, sometimes in public restrooms or parks. He was arrested multiple times in 1981, 1983, 1987, each time for offenses involving children. Each time, he received relatively lenient sentences. Counseling, probation, short jail stays. The pattern was consistent and deeply troubling in retrospect. The criminal justice system, fragmented across jurisdictions and hampered by limited resources and understanding of repeat sexual offenders, treated each incident as isolated rather than as points along a dangerous trajectory. Psychological evaluations conducted during this period painted a portrait of a man who understood, intellectually, that his desires were wrong, but who felt powerless to control them. He attended counseling sessions as mandated, said the things counselors wanted to hear, and was generally compliant in structured settings. But compliance is not the same as change, and in Dodd's case, the compulsions were not diminishing. They were intensifying. He began keeping detailed diaries, logs of his activities and fantasies, written with the same meticulous attention to detail one might apply to a work project or hobby. These journals would later provide investigators with an unprecedented window into his psychology, but at the time, no one knew they existed. By 1989, Dodd was living in Vancouver, Washington, a mid-sized city just across the Columbia River from Portland, Oregon. He had a job at a paper mill, a small apartment, a routine. To those who encountered him casually, at work or in his apartment building, he seemed like countless other single men in their late 20s. Unremarkable, polite enough, keeping to himself. But his internal world had become increasingly dominated by violent fantasies. The acts of molestation that had characterized his earlier offenses were no longer sufficient. He began planning something more elaborate, more final. He scouted locations, studied the patterns of families in local parks, refined his methods. The shift from opportunistic offending to premeditated hunting was complete, though no one outside his own mind yet knew it. David Douglas Park, a neighborhood recreation area in Vancouver's eastern suburbs, became a focal point of his attention. The park featured playgrounds, walking trails, wooded areas that provided both visibility and concealment. Families came there in the evenings and on weekends. Children played while parents chatted or read nearby. It was the kind of place that represented safety and community, and that made it, in Dodd's calculation, an ideal hunting ground. He visited repeatedly, observing, timing his visits to coincide with peak family activity, learning the rhythms of the place. He noted which areas had good sightlines, which paths led into deeper woods, where a person might take a child without being immediately noticed. All of this preparation was documented in his journals with chilling matter-of-factness, as though he were planning a business venture rather than contemplating murder. The late summer of 1989 was warm and dry in the Pacific Northwest, the kind of weather that keeps children outside until the last possible moment of daylight. For the families of Vancouver, it was a season of normalcy, of barbecues and bike rides, and the slow transition from summer vacation back to school routines. For Wesley Allen Dodd, it was the culmination of years of escalation, the moment when fantasy and planning converged into action. What happened next would shatter multiple families, expose systemic failures in the criminal justice system's handling of repeat sex offenders, and raise questions that remain unresolved decades later about the nature of evil, the possibility of rehabilitation, and the responsibilities of a society that releases dangerous individuals back into its midst. The evening of September 4th, 1989, began like many others at David Douglas Park. The sun hung low over the western hills, casting long shadows across the playgrounds and baseball fields. Families were beginning to gather their children, packing up picnic blankets and soccer balls, calling kids in from the woods and play structures. It was a Monday, the Labor Day holiday, and people were savoring the last moments of summer freedom before the school year began in earnest. Two brothers, 11-year-old Cole Neer and 10-year-old William Neer, had ridden their bikes to the park that evening. They were allowed to play there frequently. It was close to home, in a safe neighborhood, the kind of place where parents didn't worry excessively. The boys were exploring the wooded trails that wound through the park's eastern edge when they encountered a man who seemed friendly, unremarkable. He was slight in build, with glasses and a soft voice. He engaged them in brief conversation, the kind of casual exchange that happens in parks between adults and children all the time. Then he told them he had something to show them, something interesting deeper in the woods. What happened in those woods would only be fully understood later, through Dodd's own detailed confessions and journal entries. He led the boys away from the main paths, into an area where the trees grew denser and the sounds of the park became muffled and distant. Once he was certain they were isolated, he attacked them with a knife. Both boys fought back with desperate courage. They struggled, they tried to run, they resisted with everything they had. But they were children, and he was an adult who had planned for resistance. Cole died there in the woods. William, despite being stabbed repeatedly, managed to stagger back toward the park's more populated areas before he collapsed. He died shortly after being discovered by horrified park visitors. The scene that first responders encountered was devastating. Two young boys, bloodied and dying in what should have been a place of safety and play. The Vancouver Police Department immediately launched a massive investigation. The park was cordoned off. Witnesses were interviewed. Forensic teams combed the wooded area. The community reacted with shock and fear. Parents kept children indoors, playgrounds sat empty, and a palpable sense of violation settled over the city. Who could do such a thing? And were they still among us? Investigators had little physical evidence to work with initially. There were no clear witnesses to the actual attack, no surveillance cameras in the park, no obvious suspects. What they did have were reports of a man seen talking to children in the park on previous occasions. A man who matched a general description. White, late 20s, thin, glasses, unremarkable. It was a description that could fit thousands of men in the Vancouver area. The investigation proceeded methodically, but without a clear breakthrough, even as public pressure for answers intensified. Wesley Allen Dodd, meanwhile, returned to his apartment that night and wrote extensively in his journal about what he had done. The entries were clinical, detailed, devoid of remorse. He noted what had worked in his planning, what he might do differently next time. Next time. The murder of the Neer brothers had not satisfied his compulsions. It had confirmed that he was capable of the ultimate act of violence, and in his twisted psychology, that confirmation fed further fantasies. He went to work at the paper mill the next day as usual. He followed his normal routines. Outwardly, nothing about his behavior suggested he had just committed a double homicide. But Dodd was not finished. Less than a month later, on October 29, 1989, he set his sights on a new target. He had been frequenting a movie theater in Camas, Washington, a smaller town just east of Vancouver. The theater showed family films, and Dodd had observed that parents sometimes allowed children to attend matinees alone or with friends. On this particular Sunday afternoon, he noticed a 4-year-old boy named Liaselli who had become separated from his father in the theater. The child was crying, disoriented, looking for his parent. Dodd approached him with a gentle demeanor, offering help, gaining trust. When the opportunity arose, he led the boy out of the theater to his car. Lee's father, William Maselli, realized his son was missing within minutes and immediately alerted theater staff. The Camas Police Department was called. A search began, but the child was already gone. Dodd drove Lee to his apartment in Vancouver, a one-bedroom unit in a nondescript complex where neighbors rarely interacted. Over the next several hours, Dodd subjected the child to acts that were documented in Polaroid photographs and journal entries, evidence that would later prove crucial in court, but which detailed horrors that defy comfortable description. The child was terrified, crying for his father, begging to go home. Dodd's journals indicate he was fully aware of the child's suffering and fear. He simply did not care, or perhaps more accurately, the suffering was part of what he sought. Early the following morning, Dodd strangled Lee Aselli with a rope. He then placed the child's body in a plastic bag, drove to a wooded area near Vancouver Lake, and disposed of it in thick brush. He returned to his apartment, went to work, resumed his routine. For days, Lee Aselli remained a missing child, his face on news broadcasts and community flyers, his parents desperate for any information. Dodd watched these reports with detached interest, noting in his journal how the investigation was progressing. But Dodd's careful planning began to unravel in the weeks that followed. His compulsion was no longer satisfied by what he had done. It demanded repetition. On November 13, 1989, he returned to the same movie theater in Camas where he had abducted Lee Aselli. This time, he attempted to lure another young boy out of the theater, using the same approach. But this child was older, more wary, and when Dodd led him toward the exit, the boy became frightened and began to resist. Theater employees noticed the commotion. When Dodd tried to leave quickly with the struggling child, staff members intervened, blocking his exit. Dodd released the boy and tried to flee, but employees pursued him into the parking lot. He managed to get into his car and drive away, but witnesses had noted his license plate number. Police traced the vehicle to Wesley Allen Dodd within hours. When officers arrived at his apartment to question him about the attempted abduction at the theater, they had no idea they were about to solve two of the most disturbing cases in Washington state history. Dodd initially tried to deny involvement, but when confronted with witness statements and the license plate evidence, he suddenly became cooperative, eerily cooperative. He invited officers into his apartment, and what they found there removed any doubt about what they were dealing with. The apartment was a shrine to his crimes. Journals filled with detailed accounts of his offenses, dating back years. Photographs of Lee Aselli, diagrams and plans for future abductions. A briefcase containing ropes, knives, and other instruments. Maps of parks and public places where children gathered. It was all there, meticulously organized, a complete documentation of a predator's evolution. And Dodd confessed to everything. The Near brothers, Lee Aselli, numerous other molestations over the years. He described the crimes with disturbing precision, answered questions calmly, showed detectives where he had left Lee Aselli's body. When officers asked why he was being so forthcoming, he gave an answer that would haunt everyone involved in the case. He said he knew he couldn't stop, that he would do it again if given the chance, and that he wanted people to understand who and what he was. The arrest of Wesley Allen Dodd on November 13, 1989, brought both relief and horror to the communities of Vancouver and Camas. Relief that a predator had been caught, that no more children would fall victim to his compulsions. Horror at the scope and nature of what he had done, and at the realization that he had been living among them, working alongside them, passing unnoticed through their world while carrying out acts of unfathomable violence. The recovery of Lee Aselli's body from the wooded area near Vancouver Lake confirmed Dodd's confession in its most painful details. The child had been dead for more than 2 weeks, his parents having endured that time oscillating between hope and dread. The notification that their son had been found, and the circumstances of his death, shattered the Aselli family in ways that no amount of justice could ever fully repair. Similarly, the Near family, who had already buried their 2 sons, now learned the identity of the man who had taken them and the calculated nature of their murders. These were not random acts of violence or impulsive crimes of opportunity. They were the culmination of a lifetime of escalating offenses, carried out by someone who had been given multiple chances to change and had used those chances to refine his methods instead. The criminal justice system moved swiftly. Dodd was charged with 3 counts of aggravated first-degree murder, along with additional charges related to attempted kidnapping and previous offenses. The evidence against him was overwhelming. His detailed confessions, the physical evidence recovered from his apartment, the photographs, the journals, the witness statements from the theater. There was no question of guilt. The only questions were procedural and philosophical. How would the state pursue punishment? And what did this case reveal about the failures that had allowed Dodd to reach this point? Washington state had the death penalty, though it was rarely sought and even more rarely carried out. Prosecutors, in consultation with the victims' families, decided this case warranted capital charges. The families wanted the ultimate penalty not out of simple vengeance, though anger certainly played a role, but because they believed, based on everything Dodd himself had said, that he represented a permanent and irredeemable danger to children. He had told investigators he would offend again if released. He had shown no remorse, only a kind of clinical interest in his own psychology. How could such a person ever be safely returned to society? Dodd's trial began in June 1990 in Clark County Superior Court. His defense attorneys faced a nearly impossible task. The evidence was incontrovertible. Their client had confessed to everything, and public sentiment was understandably fierce. They attempted to introduce evidence of Dodd's troubled childhood and psychological issues, arguing for a life sentence rather than death, but the prosecution's case was devastating. They presented the journals in which Dodd had detailed not only what he had done but what he planned to do in the future. They showed the photographs. They brought forward experts who testified that Dodd met every clinical criterion for antisocial personality disorder and showed characteristics of sadistic behavior that had intensified over time rather than diminishing. Perhaps most damaging, they played portions of Dodd's own statements to police, in which he calmly explained that he knew what he was doing was wrong, but that the compulsion was stronger than any moral understanding, and that he believed he would eventually be released or escape and would offend again. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. The penalty phase began shortly thereafter, and again the jury's decision came quickly. On July 15, 1990, Wesley Allen Dodd was sentenced to death. Under Washington law at the time, condemned prisoners had a choice of execution methods: lethal injection or hanging. Hanging had been the traditional method in Washington but had been largely phased out in favor of lethal injection, which was considered more humane and modern. Dodd, however, made a choice that stunned many observers. He requested hanging specifically and deliberately. When asked why, he stated that hanging was how Lee Aselli had died, and that he deserved the same fate. It was a statement that seemed to gesture toward some recognition of proportional justice, yet it came from a man who had shown no genuine remorse for his victim's suffering. The years between sentence and execution were marked by multiple appeals, all of which Dodd actively opposed. Unlike most death row inmates, who exhaust every legal avenue to delay or overturn their sentences, Dodd repeatedly stated he wanted the execution carried out as quickly as possible. He gave interviews to journalists and researchers, speaking with the same calm, analytical tone that characterized his confessions. He described his progression from early exhibitionism to molestation to murder as a predictable escalation, something he had felt building within himself for years. He was critical of the criminal justice system's handling of his earlier offenses, noting that lenient sentences and ineffective counseling had given him opportunities to continue offending. There was something deeply unsettling about these interviews, a sense that Dodd understood intellectually what remorse should look like but was fundamentally incapable of feeling it. Mental health professionals who evaluated Dodd during this period were divided on certain questions but unanimous on others. All agreed he met diagnostic criteria for pedophilia and antisocial personality disorder. Most believed he demonstrated sadistic tendencies and a complete absence of empathy. Where they disagreed was on the question of whether he could have been successfully treated earlier in his life, had interventions been more intensive and sustained. Some argued that, with proper treatment in adolescence or early adulthood, his trajectory might have been altered. Others contended that certain individuals represent such fundamental distortions of normal human psychology that no intervention could truly change them, only contain them. Dodd himself believed he was beyond rehabilitation, a position that conveniently aligned with his desire to be executed rather than spend decades in prison. The legal machinery ground on through 1991 and 1992. Various appeals were filed by parties with standing to do so, even though Dodd himself opposed them. Civil liberties organizations raised concerns about the use of hanging, arguing it constituted cruel and unusual punishment. These challenges were ultimately rejected by both state and federal courts, which found that since Dodd had voluntarily chosen the method and Washington law permitted it, there was no constitutional violation. Throughout this process, the families of the victims maintained a painful vigil, caught between wanting closure and being forced to relive their trauma with each legal development. By early 1993, all appeals had been exhausted. A date was set for execution, January 5, 1993. Washington State Prison in Walla Walla prepared the gallows, a device that had not been used in decades. Dodd spent his final months in administrative segregation, writing letters, giving final interviews, maintaining the same eerie composure that had characterized his entire incarceration. He requested that his execution be witnessed by members of the victims' families, saying he wanted them to see that justice was being carried out. Some family members chose to attend. Others could not bear to do so. In the early hours of January 5, 1993, Wesley Allen Dodd was led from his cell at Washington State Prison to the execution chamber. He was 41 years old, just over 3 years removed from the crimes that had brought him to this moment. The gallows had been tested and prepared, witnesses had assembled in an adjacent room separated by glass, and officials had completed all required protocols. Dodd was given an opportunity to make a final statement. He declined to address the victims' families specifically, instead making brief comments about hoping his case would lead to changes in how the justice system handled sex offenders. At 12:05 a.m., the trapdoor opened. Death was pronounced minutes later. He was the first person executed by hanging in the United States in nearly 3 decades, and he remains the last to die by that method in modern American history. The execution of Wesley Allen Dodd closed one chapter but opened many others. In the immediate aftermath, there was a sense among the victims' families that some measure of justice had been served, though all acknowledged that no punishment could ever restore what had been taken from them. Leah Selly's parents released a statement expressing relief that Dodd could never harm another child, but also profound sorrow that such relief required their son's death to have meaning. The Neer family echoed these sentiments, their grief undiminished by the execution but perhaps their anger given some direction and resolution. For the broader community and for criminal justice professionals across the country, Dodd's case became a focal point for debates that continue to this day. His long history of escalating offenses, his multiple arrests and releases, the system's repeated failure to recognize the danger he posed, all of these raised urgent questions about how society manages sexual offenders. In the wake of his crimes, Washington State revised its laws regarding sentencing for sex crimes and monitoring of repeat offenders. The state implemented more stringent registration requirements, longer sentences, and civil commitment provisions for sexually violent predators who had completed criminal sentences but were deemed too dangerous to release. These changes, often referred to collectively as part of the sexually violent predator statutes, spread to other states and became part of a nationwide reassessment of how to balance public safety with civil liberties. Yet even these reforms could not resolve the fundamental dilemma that Dodd's case presented. What does a society do with individuals who genuinely cannot be rehabilitated, who will remain dangerous regardless of treatment or punishment? The traditional criminal justice model assumes that punishment serves some combination of retribution, deterrence, incapacitation, and rehabilitation. But Dodd seemed to exist outside this framework. He was not deterred by punishment. He sought retribution against himself. Incapacitation only worked as long as it was absolute, and rehabilitation appeared impossible. His own psychological makeup was so fundamentally disordered that conventional approaches seemed irrelevant. Researchers studying Dodd's case have noted the unusual level of documentation he left behind. His journals, spanning years, provide an almost unprecedented window into the mind of a serial predator. Most offenders destroy evidence or minimize their actions. Dodd preserved everything with meticulous care. Psychologists have theorized various reasons for this. A need for validation through documentation, a kind of narcissistic desire to be understood and remembered, perhaps even an unconscious wish to be stopped. Whatever the motivation, the journals have been studied extensively in academic and law enforcement contexts, used to train investigators and mental health professionals in recognizing patterns of escalation and markers of extreme dangerousness. One of the most disturbing revelations from Dodd's documentation was the extent to which his earlier encounters with the criminal justice system had failed to intervene effectively. He had been arrested multiple times before the murders, evaluated repeatedly, placed on probation with counseling requirements. Yet nothing had stopped his progression. In some cases, evaluators had noted his high risk of reoffense but lacked the legal tools to keep him incarcerated beyond his sentence. In other cases, he had successfully manipulated treatment providers, saying what they wanted to hear while his internal compulsions continued unabated. The fragmented nature of the justice system, with different jurisdictions and agencies often failing to communicate effectively, meant that no single entity had a complete picture of his offense history. These systemic failures led to concrete changes, but questions remain about whether such changes are sufficient. Dodd's case suggests that there exists a subset of offenders for whom the risk of reoffense is so high and the potential harm so severe that traditional sentencing models are inadequate. Some states responded by implementing indefinite civil commitment for sexually violent predators, a controversial approach that allows for continued detention after criminal sentences are served if the individual is deemed mentally abnormal and likely to reoffend. Critics argue this amounts to preventive detention and violates due process rights. Proponents contend it is necessary to protect vulnerable potential victims from individuals like Dodd. The question of execution itself remains contentious. Dodd's case is sometimes cited by death penalty advocates as an example of a crime so heinous and a perpetrator so irredeemable that capital punishment is justified. His own request for execution and his statements that he would offend again if given the opportunity seem to support this position. Opponents of capital punishment counter that Dodd's mental illness made him less than fully morally responsible, that the state should not be in the business of killing people regardless of their crimes, and that life without possibility of parole would have achieved the same public safety outcome without the moral and legal complications of execution. What is perhaps most chilling about the Dodd case, beyond the immediate horror of his crimes, is what it suggests about the limits of human nature and social institutions. The families affected by his actions have had to find ways to live with permanent loss and trauma. Some have become advocates for victims' rights and stronger sex offender laws. Others have retreated from public life, seeking what privacy and peace they can find. The community of Vancouver, once shaken to its core, has slowly recovered its sense of normalcy, though certain places, like David Douglas Park, carry memories that do not fade. Wesley Allen Dodd has been dead for more than 3 decades now, but the questions his life and crimes raised have not been answered satisfactorily. Can we identify individuals like him before they escalate to murder? Can they be treated effectively or only contained? What obligations does society have to potential future victims versus the rights of convicted offenders who have served their sentences? How do we balance the desire for rehabilitation with the reality that some people may be beyond its reach? These are not abstract philosophical questions. They have immediate practical implications for how we structure laws, allocate resources, and make decisions about release and monitoring of sex offenders. In the end, perhaps the most honest conclusion is that cases like Dodd's expose the uncomfortable truth that our systems, whether legal, mental health, or social, have limits. They cannot prevent all tragedies, cannot rehabilitate all offenders, cannot provide complete closure or healing to all victims. They can only attempt to learn from failures, to adjust and improve incrementally, and to hold in tension the competing values of justice, safety, liberty, and compassion. The 3 young boys who died, Cole Neer, William Neer, and Leah Selly, deserved better than the world gave them. Their families deserved to never know such pain. And the children who might have become Dodd's future victims, had he not been stopped when he was, owe their safety to witness theater employees who acted when something felt wrong, and to investigators who built a case that ensured he would never be free again. The story does not end with neat resolution or satisfying answers, because that is not how such stories end in reality. It ends with an empty cell in Walla Walla, with families forever altered, with laws changed and systems reformed but not perfected, and with the knowledge that somewhere, perhaps at this very moment, another quiet, unremarkable person is making choices that will one day force us to confront these same terrible questions again. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. The Bayou Strangler. The Hidden Decade. There are towns in Louisiana where Spanish moss hangs so thick from the cypress trees that daylight struggles to reach the ground. Towns where the water moves slow, where people know their neighbors, where trust is currency. In Thibodaux, in Homa, in the parishes that cradle the bayou, hospitality isn't just custom, it's survival. You help the stranger on the roadside. You offer a ride when someone's walking. You don't ask too many questions because tomorrow you might be the one who needs help. Between 1997 and 2006, someone understood this culture intimately. Someone who looked harmless. Someone who blended into the background so completely that when young men started disappearing, when bodies began appearing in cane fields and along rural highways, no one thought to look at the quiet man delivering pizzas, the one who sometimes walked with a cane, the one who seemed more pathetic than dangerous. Ronald Joseph Dominique was 5 feet 5 inches tall, overweight, frequently complaining about his heart condition. He was easy to dismiss, easy to forget. And for nearly 10 years, as he confessed to taking the lives of 23 men, that's exactly what happened. This is not a story about a monster. Monsters are obvious. This is a story about invisibility, about who we choose to see and who we choose to ignore, about the men who vanished and the communities that struggled to notice they were gone. The parishes of southeastern Louisiana exist in a geography that feels removed from the rest of America. Terrebonne, Lafourche, St. Charles, Jefferson. These are places where the land disputes with water for dominance, where highways cut through swampland and sugarcane fields stretch toward horizons that shimmer in the heat. The communities here are tight, layered with generations of families who fished the same waters and worked the same soil. French surnames dominate. Catholic traditions run deep. And in 1997, when the first body appeared, these were communities already grappling with economic uncertainty, with the slow erosion of industries that had sustained them. Thibodaux sits in Lafourche Parish, a town of approximately 15,000 people, when Ronald Dominique was born there on January 9, 1964. He was the youngest of 6 children in a family that worked labor jobs and lived in a trailer park on the outskirts of town. The details of his childhood come to us in fragments. A melancholic temperament, difficulty communicating, weight problems that made him a target for bullying. He graduated from Thibodaux High School in 1983, sang in the choir, didn't drink or do drugs or play sports. He briefly attended Nichols State University with plans to study computer science, but dropped out in the mid-1980s. What we know with more certainty is that shortly before graduating high school, Ronald Dominique realized he was gay. He began visiting local gay bars, but classmates saw him there. The harassment intensified. In a small town in the Deep South during the early 1980s, being gay wasn't just socially difficult. It was isolating in ways that carved deep. Dominique denied the rumors about his sexuality, but the damage was done. He existed on the periphery of multiple communities, too poor to fit comfortably anywhere, too different to belong. On July 12, 1997, someone found the body of 19-year-old David Levern Mitchell in a ditch along a highway in St. Charles Parish. He'd been hitchhiking home from a family birthday party when he accepted a ride. 2 days later, his partially clothed body was discovered. The cause of death was strangulation. There were signs of sexual assault. In December of that same year, 20-year-old Gary Pierre was found dead. The similarities were notable. Young African-American man, evidence of strangulation, body disposed of in an isolated location. Then, in July 1998, 38-year-old Larry Ranson was discovered. This victim showed signs of having been bound before death. In early October 1998, the body of 27-year-old Oliver Lubanks was found on the outskirts of Metairie in Jefferson Parish. The autopsy revealed something crucial. traces of semen that would later become key evidence, though at the time, there was no DNA match in any database. By the end of 1999, 9 bodies had been found. All men, all showing the distinctive marks of strangulation, all discovered in secondary locations, cane fields, ditches, remote stretches of road where someone could stop a vehicle without drawing attention. The parishes involved: Jefferson, St. Charles, Terrebonne, Lafourche, were distinct jurisdictions with their own sheriff's departments, their own investigative priorities, their own limited resources. And something else connected these victims, something that would later become a point of painful examination. Most were African American, many had histories of drug use or were engaged in sex work, several were homeless or transient. In the calculus of which missing persons receive urgent attention, which investigations receive funding, which families receive media coverage, these men occupied a vulnerable position. Their disappearances didn't generate headlines. Their deaths didn't spark widespread fear in the broader community. While bodies accumulated, Ronald Dominique was moving through the same parishes, working low-wage jobs, pizza delivery, meter reading. He lived with his sister in Bayou Bleu, a small, unincorporated area in Terrebonne Parish. Neighbors described him as quiet, unassuming, someone who kept to himself. He drove a pickup truck. He had health problems, a heart condition that sometimes required him to use a cane. He performed occasionally at gay bars, dressing as Patti LaBelle, though by multiple accounts he wasn't well received. The local gay community, already small and often marginalized itself, tended to look down on him, mocking him for things like the motorized bike he'd won from McDonald's, referring to him as Miss Moped. But there were warning signs, moments when Ronald Dominique's capacity for violence surfaced. In 1993, a man in Houma reported to Thibodaux police that Dominique had raped him. Officers chose not to make an arrest. In August 1996, neighbors witnessed a partially naked teenage boy leap from the window of the residence where Dominique lived with his sister. The boy was screaming for help, telling anyone who would listen that Ronald Dominique had raped him and tried to kill him. This time, there was an arrest. Bail was set at $100,000. Dominique spent time in jail awaiting trial. Later, he would tell investigators that during this incarceration, he was sexually assaulted by other prisoners, an experience he claimed had profound psychological impact. But when the case was transferred to court, prosecutors couldn't locate the victim. They didn't even know the boy's real name. In November 1996, the charges were dismissed. 6 months later, Ronald Dominique killed David Levern Mitchell. To understand how someone could kill 23 people over nearly a decade in a relatively small geographic area requires understanding the social landscape. The late 1990s and early 2000s in southeastern Louisiana were marked by economic transition. Traditional industries were declining. Poverty rates were high. Drug addiction, particularly to crack cocaine and later methamphetamine, was devastating certain populations. Young men, especially young black men, especially those struggling with addiction or engaged in survival sex work, existed in a state of precarity that made them both vulnerable to predators and less visible to institutions designed to protect. The gay community in this region faced its own complex challenges. In small-town Louisiana, being openly gay carried social costs. Gay bars existed, but they were spaces of both liberation and risk. Men who frequented these establishments weren't always out to their families, their employers, their churches. Discretion was often necessary for survival. And this discretion, this need to keep certain parts of life hidden, created opportunities for someone like Ronald Dominique. He understood the codes, the unspoken agreements. He knew which men might accept a ride without telling anyone where they were going. He knew how to offer something: money, drugs, shelter, the promise of connection, in ways that felt safe enough to accept. And he knew that in communities where trust was essential, where hospitality was woven into the culture, his outward appearance as a harmless, struggling man with health problems would disarm suspicion. By the year 2000, as the body count reached double digits, the murders came to a sudden halt for a period. Investigators who were beginning to notice patterns wondered if the killer had died or been incarcerated for another offense. What actually happened during this lull remains unclear, though it's worth noting that Dominique was arrested again in February 2002 for assaulting a woman during a Mardi Gras festival in Terrebonne Parish. He claimed she had dangerously struck a baby stroller with her vehicle, and when she apologized after he confronted her, he punched her in the face. He was charged, but the case was later dropped after he and the woman reached a reconciliation agreement. The killings resumed. In October 2002, 26-year-old Anoka Jones was found under a highway overpass in Homa, his body showing the now familiar signs. In early 2003, 19-year-old Datrell Woods was discovered in a reed field, his decomposed body lying beside his bicycle. The coroner initially deemed the death accidental, attributing it to asthma, though later evidence would prove otherwise. By 2004, the frequency increased. In October, 46-year-old Larry Matthews was killed. Matthews was homeless, and nobody initially reported him missing. His identity had to be established through fingerprints after his body was found 20 miles from where he'd last been seen. Later that same month, 21-year-old Michael Barnett was discovered, notably, Dominique's first white victim, a detail that would eventually help investigators recognize that the killer wasn't restricting himself to one racial group. In February 2005, 22-year-old Leon Learitt was murdered. Learitt had previously lived with two other victims, Michael Barnett and Anoka Jones, and had actually been considered a suspect in Jones' murder because he was the last person seen with him before he disappeared. Now Learitt himself was dead, creating an eerie connection between victims that investigators were only beginning to map. 2 months later, in April 2005, 31-year-old August Watkins was killed. When Watkins' body was found, something finally clicked for law enforcement. The murders in Kenner and Homa, which had seemed like separate cases handled by different jurisdictions, showed strikingly similar modus operandi. For the first time, agencies seriously considered that a serial killer was operating in the region. The case was handed over to the FBI. The FBI's involvement brought resources and expertise, but it also brought a sobering realization about the scope of what they were facing. Special Agent Jim Bernazzani would later describe Dominique's case as the most significant serial homicide investigation in the country over the past 2 decades, in terms of both death toll and duration. Days after killing August Watkins, Dominique murdered 23-year-old Kurt Cunningham. That summer, he killed 28-year-old Alonzo Hogan in St. Charles Parish and 17-year-old Wayne Smith in Terrebonne Parish. In September 2005, as Hurricane Katrina devastated the Gulf Coast and displaced hundreds of thousands of people, 40-year-old Chris DeVille was trying to hitchhike out of Napoleonville when he encountered Ronald Dominique. DeVille's skeletal remains were discovered the following month, identified only through personal belongings left beside the body. In late November 2005, 21-year-old Nicholas Pellegrin was killed in Lafourche Parish. His family told police that shortly before his death, Pellegrin had borrowed $400 from local drug dealers and missed the payment deadline, after which he began receiving death threats. For months, investigators wrongly assumed his death was drug-related. By 2005, a multi-parish task force had formed, bringing together sheriffs and detectives from across southeastern Louisiana. The Louisiana State Police were involved. The FBI had assigned profilers. They were using data analysis techniques to identify patterns in victim selection and dump sites, but they were also confronting a series of obstacles that, in retrospect, reveal systemic issues about how we investigate crimes and whose victimization we prioritize. The jurisdictional fragmentation was a significant problem. Louisiana's parish system meant that each body found was, initially, the responsibility of the parish where it was discovered. Information sharing between agencies was inconsistent. Some parishes had more resources than others. Some had more experience with homicide investigation. Creating a unified database of victims, identifying commonalities, building a comprehensive timeline. All of this took time that, for some victims, ran out. There was also the challenge of victimology. When young men from marginalized communities go missing, the response is often different than when middle-class white women disappear. This isn't speculation. It's documented pattern in criminology research. Media coverage is less intense. Public pressure on law enforcement is less sustained. Resources allocated to investigation can be less robust. Several of Dominique's victims were never reported missing at all. Some were homeless. Some were estranged from families who didn't know where they were or had given up trying to maintain contact. Detective Dennis Thornton of the Jefferson Parish Sheriff's Office would later explain to media that they were looking for connections, comparing notes across cases, observing commonalities in victim profiles and cause of death. Sergeant Steve Carraway of the Kenner Police Department recalled the moment they realized they were dealing with a serial killer, a recognition that came years into the pattern. The forensic evidence was there, but utilizing it effectively required overcoming bureaucratic and technological limitations. DNA samples had been collected from crime scenes as early as 1998, when Oliver Lubanks was killed. But getting those samples into databases, running comparisons, following up on potential matches, all of this moved slowly. The combined DNA index system, CODIS, was expanding during this period, but it was only as effective as the samples entered into it. Based on later confessions and surviving witness testimony, we know how Ronald Dominique operated. He would drive through neighborhoods in his pickup truck, sometimes through areas known for drug activity or sex work. He frequented gay bars. He'd approach men on foot, strike up conversations, offer rides. His approach varied based on the person. For men he thought might be gay, he'd be direct about offering money for companionship. For men he thought might be straight, he'd show a photograph of an attractive woman he claimed was his wife or girlfriend, suggesting they could come back to his place and have sex with her, maybe participate in a threesome. The offers included money, drugs, alcohol, shelter, whatever seemed most likely to appeal. He targeted people who appeared desperate, as he would later admit. People who were homeless or close to it. People struggling with addiction. People who needed $40 badly enough to get into a truck with a stranger. Once at his residence, typically a trailer where he lived with his sister in Bayou Blue, Dominique would suggest bondage as part of a sexual encounter. He'd present ropes or handcuffs, claiming it was just a game, something exciting. And here's a detail that makes this case particularly disturbing. Dominique claimed in his confession that if a potential victim refused to be restrained, he would let them go unharmed. This suggests that some number of men, we'll never know how many, declined the restraints and walked away, never knowing how close they'd come to becoming another body in a cane field. It also means that 23 men agreed to be tied up in the home of someone they just met, which speaks to either desperation, trust, intoxication, or some combination of factors that made the situation seem acceptable in the moment. Once his victims were bound, Dominique would rape them. Then he would strangle or suffocate them. He used various methods: his hands, a seatbelt, an extension cord, whatever was available. After death, he would load the bodies into his truck and drive to isolated locations to dispose of them. Sometimes this meant cane fields, sometimes ditches along rural highways, sometimes bayou areas where decomposition would be accelerated by heat and wildlife. When questioned about his motive, Dominique told investigators he killed to eliminate witnesses. He'd been arrested in 1996 for rape, had spent time in jail, and said he was unwilling to ever return to prison. That experience, he claimed, had left him in a perpetually negative emotional state and triggered symptoms of mental disorder. Killing his victims, from his perspective, was a pragmatic decision to avoid legal consequences. But investigators noted something else during interrogations. There were moments when Dominique would become animated, almost boastful, describing his escapades in ways that suggested he derived satisfaction from the acts beyond simple witness elimination. Forensic neuropsychologist John Fabian, commenting on the case, noted that strangulation is a very interpersonal method of killing, often driven by rage or sexual deviancy or both. It's important to resist the abstraction of numbers. 23 murders across nearly 10 years can become a statistic, a data point in criminology studies. But each represented someone's son, brother, friend, someone who had hopes and struggles, someone whose absence left a wound. David Levern Mitchell was 19, trying to get home from a family birthday party. Gary Pierre was 20. Larry Ranson was 38. Oliver Lubanks was 27 and a father of 5 children. unemployed at the time of his death. Manuel Reed was 21. Angel Mejia was 21, and the coroner found evidence he'd been tied with rope. Mitchell Johnson was 34. Michael Vincent was 23. Kenneth Randolph Jr. was 20, a neighbor of Dominique's from the same trailer park. The list continues, each name attached to a life that ended in terror and was discovered in conditions that made identification sometimes difficult. Christopher Sutterfield was 27 and had apparently begun dating Dominique in the summer of 2006, suggesting a relationship that may have made him feel safe until it didn't. Chris DeVille's sister would later testify at sentencing that they'd buried bones, that her brother had been left in a cane field for rodents to consume. Wayne Smith's mother wrote in a letter read at trial that she'd put something in the ground but never got to see her baby. Didn't know for certain if her child was really dead because she never saw the body. These details aren't included for shock value. They're included because the aftermath of murder extends far beyond the moment of death, into the lives of families who must continue existing with an absence that can never be filled. In 2006, a man named Ricky Wallace was on parole in Terrebonne Parish. He was struggling, as many recently released individuals do, trying to navigate life outside prison with limited resources and the stigma of a criminal record. One day, a heavy-set white man in a pickup truck offered him a ride. The man had a photograph on his dashboard, an attractive woman. He asked Wallace if he'd like to have sex with this woman, if he'd be willing to be tied up by her. The offer probably seemed strange, but Wallace agreed and got in the truck. They drove to an area with 2 trailers. When they arrived, there was no woman. The situation became uncomfortable, threatening, but Wallace managed to leave without serious harm. Later, he mentioned this incident to his parole officer, describing the trailers, the truck, the man who had lured him there with false promises. The parole officer recognized that this description might be significant. Information was shared with the task force investigating the serial murders. Because Houma is a small town, investigators were able to find the trailers Wallace described. They identified the pickup truck driver as Ronald Joseph Dominique, age 41, living at his sister's property. Surveillance began. Dominique's background was checked, revealing the previous arrests: sexual harassment by phone in 1985, drunk driving in 1994, the forcible rape charge in 1996 that had been dismissed, the assault charge from 2002. The pattern of boundary violations, of escalating aggression, was there in the record. Investigators' interest intensified. After 2 months of surveillance, Dominique was brought in for questioning. Detectives told him they wanted to discuss Ricky Wallace. While Dominique didn't recognize the name, he understood the situation being described. He denied any wrongdoing, claimed the 1996 rape arrest had been unjust, insisted the alleged victim had tried to rape him instead. Dominique agreed to provide a DNA sample. He seemed cooperative, even helpful. Investigators swabbed his cheek and sent the sample for testing. Over the next week, the DNA results came back. Dominique's genetic profile matched the semen found on the bodies of Oliver Lubanks and Manuel Reed, victims from years earlier. After nearly a decade of investigation, across multiple parishes, involving hundreds of hours of detective work and the dedication of a multi-agency task force, they finally had their suspect. An arrest warrant was issued. On December 1, 2006, police found Ronald Dominique at a homeless shelter in Houma. When they arrested him, Dominique made a telling comment. He said he'd known it was only a matter of time before he was captured, so he'd moved out of his sister's house to avoid inconveniencing her. Even in this moment, he was thinking about appearances, about not causing trouble for family, about maintaining some veneer of consideration. At the police station, Dominique waived his right to counsel. He spoke with investigators for 9 hours. What emerged during that conversation was a confession that shocked even experienced homicide detectives. Dominique admitted to 23 murders between 1997 and 2006. He provided details that only the killer and investigators knew: locations of bodies, specific methods used, descriptions of victims. He drew maps showing where he dumped remains. Some of these locations led to discoveries of bodies that hadn't yet been found. Terrebonne Parish Sheriff Jerry Larpenta would tell media that Dominique had stated how, when, and where the victims were killed. The scope and candor of the confession was overwhelming. This wasn't a suspect denying involvement or offering partial admissions. This was someone unburdening himself of nearly a decade's worth of secrets. During the interrogation, Dominique maintained certain narratives. He insisted that many of his victims had voluntarily agreed to be tied up, framing their consent to bondage as somehow mitigating his actions. He claimed he only killed to avoid returning to prison, that witnessing elimination was the primary motive. But he also, according to Detective Thornton, had moments of seeming pride, of describing encounters in ways that suggested gratification beyond practical necessity. He told investigators he killed them because he didn't want to get caught. But Thornton and others suspected that somewhere along the way, Dominique had discovered he liked it. The first murder might have been about eliminating a witness. The 23rd was about something else. Following the confession, prosecutors across multiple parishes had to decide how to proceed. Dominique had killed in Terrebonne, Lafourche, St. Charles, Jefferson, and other parishes. Each jurisdiction had the right to charge him. Each had families seeking justice. But there were also practical considerations. The cost of multiple trials, the emotional toll on families who would have to testify repeatedly, the reality that even one first-degree murder conviction in Louisiana could result in life without parole or death. Consultations occurred with victims' families. A plea agreement was offered. If Dominique pleaded guilty to 8 counts of first-degree murder in Terrebonne Parish, he would receive 8 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, but he would avoid the death penalty. The other parishes would retain the right to prosecute him if they chose. But given the sentence he'd already be serving, additional trials seemed unnecessary. On September 23, 2008, Ronald Dominique stood in a Terrebonne Parish courtroom. State District Judge Randy Bethencourt presided. Dominique was 44 years old now, shackled at the waist and feet, standing hunched over with his head bowed. The courtroom was filled with relatives of the victims. Nearly 30 family members had come to witness this moment. Assistant District Attorney Mark Rhodes addressed the court before sentencing. The lives of 8 young men were taken from these families by the actions of the defendant. He knew nothing about them or their families, and he callously killed the victims and left a lifetime of pain as their legacy. Dominique pleaded guilty to 8 counts of first-degree murder. The victims named in the charges were Kenneth Randolph Jr., Michael Barnett, Leon Lirett, August Watkins, Kurt Cunningham, Alonzo Hogan, Chris DeVille, and Wayne Smith. Though he'd confessed to 23 murders, only 8 were prosecuted as part of the plea agreement. During the hearing, family members were given the opportunity to testify about the impact of their losses. Chris Cunningham, sobbing, spoke about his brother Kurt. "I'll miss him to the day I die." Chris Barabin, sister of victim Chris DeVille, described the horror of identification. "He left my brother in a cane field for rodents to eat off him. He was nothing but bones. We had to bury bones." Angela Smith, Wayne's mother, had written a letter that was read in court. "It's been 3 years and I haven't seen my baby yet. I put something in the ground, and I really don't know if my child is dead or not, because I did not get a chance to see my baby." Dominique sat with his head down, turned away from the families. When Judge Bethencourt asked him questions, he responded with "yes, sir," and "no, sir." When offered the opportunity to make a statement, he declined. Judge Bethencourt sentenced Ronald Joseph Dominique to 8 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. He was transported to Louisiana State Penitentiary in Angola, where he remains today. In the wake of Dominique's conviction, there was necessary examination of how someone could operate undetected for so long. The FBI's special agent in charge, Jim Bernazzani, stated publicly that this was one of the most significant serial homicide cases in recent American history by both victim count and duration. Yet outside of Louisiana, the case received relatively little national media attention. This disparity in coverage became a point of painful discussion. Why did some serial killers become household names while others remained obscure? The answer, uncomfortable but documented, relates to whose lives are considered newsworthy. Dominique's victims were predominantly African American men, many struggling with poverty or addiction, several engaged in sex work or living on the margins of society. These are populations whose disappearances don't typically generate sustained media coverage or public outcry. Louisiana's response included systemic changes. The state expanded mandatory DNA collection for felony arrests, recognizing that if Dominique's 1996 rape arrest had been entered into Cody's promptly, subsequent murders might have been prevented. Inter-parish data sharing improved, with better systems for recognizing patterns across jurisdictional boundaries. LGBTQ advocacy groups and homeless outreach organizations cited the case as evidence that bias, both in media coverage and investigative priority, can literally cost lives. Sensitivity training programs were implemented within law enforcement agencies. But these institutional changes, while meaningful, couldn't undo what had already happened or fully address the deeper questions the case raised about which members of society we protect and which we allow to remain vulnerable. For the families of the 23 victims, there was no neat resolution. Some got confirmation about what had happened to their loved ones, closure in the form of knowing where and why. Others never fully recovered the remains. Some never got answers to specific questions about their family members' final moments. The sentencing hearing provided a moment of public recognition, but it also highlighted disparities even among victims. Only 8 of the 23 murders were prosecuted. The other 15 families didn't get to see their loved ones' names read in court, didn't get to offer victim impact statements, didn't receive the formal acknowledgement that comes with prosecution. This wasn't because prosecutors didn't believe Dominique had killed those men. His confession was detailed and corroborated, but rather because the plea agreement made additional trials unnecessary from a legal standpoint. Support groups formed in the affected communities. Vigils were held. Memorials were created. But the work of grief is individual and ongoing, and many families struggled with anger not just at Dominique but at systems that had failed to protect their loved ones, that had allowed warning signs to go unheeded, that had treated these missing men as lower priority than other cases. In southeastern Louisiana, the case shattered assumptions about safety in small communities. Towns like Houma and Thibodaux had low crime rates in many categories, places where people didn't typically lock doors, where children played outside unsupervised, where the culture of hospitality meant helping strangers. Dominique exploited that culture, weaponized it against people who were vulnerable. The gay community in the region experienced the case as a particular trauma. These were already spaces of precarity, where being openly gay could result in social ostracism or worse, where discretion was often necessary for survival. The revelation that someone had been targeting men from gay bars, exploiting the trust that develops in these limited social spaces, created fear and suspicion that took years to process. There was also reckoning with the reality that bullying and marginalization might have contributed to creating a killer. Multiple accounts describe Dominique's high school and young adult years as marked by relentless social rejection, for his weight, for his sexuality, for his economic background. This doesn't excuse his actions or suggest victims somehow contributed to their own victimization. But it raises questions about how societies create the conditions in which violence becomes possible, how isolation and humiliation can warp a person's relationship to other human beings. Forensic experts who examined the case struggled with the seeming contradiction between Dominique's outward presentation and his capacity for sustained violence. At 5 feet 5 inches tall, overweight, often using a cane due to a heart condition, he didn't fit standard profiles of serial killers. He wasn't charismatic in the way Ted Bundy had been. He wasn't physically imposing. He lived a fairly marginal existence, working low-wage jobs, dependent on family for housing. Yet he killed at least 23 people over nearly 10 years. He successfully evaded detection despite multiple prior arrests, despite leaving DNA evidence, despite operating in a relatively small geographic area. How? Part of the answer lies in cognitive biases about who looks dangerous. Dominique understood that his appearance, physically non-threatening, seemingly pathetic, would disarm suspicion. People underestimated him, which gave him operational advantage. Detective accounts suggest he was more intelligent than he appeared, capable of strategic thinking about victim selection, body disposal, and maintaining a facade of normalcy. Another part of the answer relates to his victim selection. By targeting marginalized populations, people whose disappearances might not be immediately noticed or rigorously investigated, he created a buffer of invisibility. Some victims were never reported missing. Others were known to move frequently, to be estranged from family, to engage in risky behaviors that could provide alternative explanations for disappearance. Forensic psychologists note that Dominique exhibited behaviors consistent with sexual sadism. The binding of victims, the combination of sexual assault and killing, the escalation in frequency over time. His claim that he killed only to eliminate witnesses is contradicted by the evidence of bondage and assault that preceded death, by the fact that he could have simply fled after the assaults, by the compulsive repetition of the pattern. The cognitive distortion he displayed in interrogations, claiming his victims had raped him, portraying himself as the aggrieved party, is common among sex offenders. It allows them to maintain an internal narrative in which their actions are defensive or justified rather than predatory. Despite Dominique's confession, uncertainties remain. He confessed to 23 murders, but investigators have wondered whether there might be more victims. The pattern operated for nearly a decade. Some bodies were only found because Dominique drew maps during his confession, leading police to remains they hadn't previously discovered. Are there others still out there? Remains in remote locations that haven't been found? The question of why the killings paused around 2000 for a period of time has never been fully answered. Was Dominique incarcerated for something else during that window? Did something in his personal circumstances change? Or did he simply become more careful about body disposal, leading to victims that were never found or never connected to the pattern? The case also raises broader questions about systemic failures in criminal justice and social services. If the 1996 rape charge hadn't been dismissed due to an inability to locate the victim, would subsequent murders have been prevented? If DNA collection and Cody's integration had been faster, would the pattern have been recognized earlier? If marginalized communities received the same investigative attention as more privileged populations, would the body count have been lower? These aren't hypothetical questions. They have concrete implications for policy, for resource allocation, for how we think about prevention and protection. Today, Ronald Joseph Dominique, age 60, remains incarcerated at Louisiana State Penitentiary in Angola, a maximum security facility that also houses death row, though Dominique will not face execution. He will die in prison, but from natural causes rather than state-imposed sentence. The communities he terrorized continue to carry the weight of what happened. Memorials and remembrance events occur periodically. Victim advocacy groups use the case as an example of why marginalized populations need specific protections, why media representation matters, why investigative resources can't be allocated based on implicit biases about whose life has value. Law enforcement agencies use the case in training, particularly around the importance of interjurisdictional cooperation, of taking early warning signs seriously, of understanding how predators select victims based on vulnerability. The case appears in criminology textbooks, in forensic psychology literature, in discussions about how serial killers operate and how investigations can be improved. But perhaps the most important legacy is the continuing conversation about the victims themselves. Not as statistics or examples, but as people who deserved safety, who deserved to be protected, who deserved investigation when they vanished. David Mitchell, who was just trying to get home from a birthday party. Kenneth Randolph Jr., who lived in the same trailer park as his killer. Wayne Smith, whose mother never got to see his body. All 23 men whose names should be remembered. This case reminds us that monsters aren't always obvious. Sometimes they're the person who seems harmless, who blends into the background, who we dismiss as too pathetic or too weak to pose a threat. And it reminds us that the most vulnerable among us, the poor, the addicted, the marginalized, those living on the edges of society, are often the ones who need protection most and receive it least. In the bayou country of Louisiana, Spanish moss still hangs thick from cypress trees. People still offer rides to strangers, still maintain the culture of hospitality that defines these communities. But there's a wariness now, a recognition that trust can be exploited, that harm can come from unexpected sources. The story of Ronald Dominique isn't just about one man's capacity for evil. It's about systems that failed, about communities that struggled to see certain lives as worthy of protection, about the invisible boundaries that determine whose disappearance sparks urgency and whose goes unnoticed. It's about the men who died, each one someone's child, someone's brother, someone whose absence created a wound that will never fully heal. And it's a reminder that the most dangerous predators are often the ones we never see coming, the ones who understand our vulnerabilities better than we understand our own, the ones who exist in plain sight while the world looks the other way. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. The photograph that disappeared. There's a kind of silence that settles over a city when someone vanishes. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of held breath, of questions whispered behind closed doors. In the spring of 1943, in the ancient streets of Prague, that silence became deafening. A young woman walked out of her apartment one ordinary morning, her footsteps echoing on cobblestone that had witnessed centuries of comings and goings, of arrivals and departures. She carried with her the mundane concerns of daily life, perhaps thoughts of work, of evening plans, of small worries that fill the hours between sunrise and sleep. But Marie Fikakova would never return to that apartment. Her disappearance would become one of those mysteries that haunts a place long after the facts have been documented, long after the files have yellowed and the witnesses have grown old and quiet. What happened to her remains, even now, a question that hangs in the air like morning fog over the Vltava River, visible enough to acknowledge, too obscure to fully penetrate. This is not a story with easy answers. It is not a story designed to satisfy our need for closure. Instead, it is a story about absence itself, about the space left behind when a life is interrupted mid-sentence, and about the desperate human need to fill that space with meaning, even when meaning refuses to reveal itself. Prague in 1943 existed in a state of uncomfortable duality. The city's Gothic spires still reached toward heaven with the same architectural grace they had possessed for centuries, but the streets below had been transformed into something far removed from the cosmopolitan center of culture and learning that had defined the Czechoslovak capital before the war. The German occupation, which had begun in March 1939 with the establishment of the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, had fundamentally altered the rhythm of daily existence. What had once been a city of cafes filled with passionate discussions of art and philosophy had become a place where conversations were measured, where certain topics were avoided, where trust became a commodity more valuable than bread. Marie Fikakova was 24 years old in the spring of that year, a woman navigating this complicated landscape with the careful attention required of those living under occupation. She had been born in 1919 in the newly independent Czechoslovakia that emerged from the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a child of hope in many ways, born into a nation that represented the possibility of self-determination after centuries of imperial rule. Her family was neither wealthy nor destitute, occupying that broad middle ground of working people who measured their lives in steady employment, modest comforts, and the expectation that each generation might build something slightly more secure than the last. She had grown up in Prague's neighborhoods, learning the geography of the city the way children do, not through maps but through lived experience, through the shortcuts between school and home, through the locations of friends' apartments and favorite shops. By all accounts, Marie was an ordinary young woman in most respects. She worked, like so many others, in one of the city's administrative offices, a position that required literacy, organization, and the ability to navigate bureaucratic systems that had grown increasingly complex under occupation administration. Her days followed a routine that would have been familiar to countless other young women in Prague during that period. Rising early, preparing for the workday, navigating the tram system, or walking through streets that grew more somber with each passing month. The social fabric of Prague during this period was defined by what people carefully did not say. The Protectorate government, headed by nominal Czech officials but controlled entirely by Nazi Germany, had implemented systems of surveillance and control that made open resistance dangerous and trust between neighbors uncertain. The Jewish population, which had been integral to Prague's cultural and economic life for centuries, was being systematically isolated, dispossessed, and deported to destinations whose true nature was still largely unknown to the general population, though rumors circulated in whispers. Those who were not directly targeted learned to keep their heads down, to maintain the appearance of normal life even as normalcy became increasingly difficult to define. Marie lived in an apartment in one of Prague's residential districts, a space that represented both independence and vulnerability for a young single woman during wartime. The details of her daily life, the friends she maintained, the family members she visited, the small pleasures she carved out in a time of restriction. These fragments suggest someone trying to maintain dignity and routine in circumstances that made both difficult. She was not politically prominent, not someone whose name appeared in newspapers or whose activities attracted particular attention from authorities. This ordinariness is itself significant because it underscores the randomness of what would happen next, the way danger could find anyone regardless of their attempts to remain invisible. The Prague she knew was a city of layers. Beneath the occupation, beneath the propaganda posters and the German street signs, the older city persisted. In the architecture, in the language spoken in homes if not always in public, in the memories of what had been and the hopes, however faint, for what might be restored. The Vltava River continued to flow through the city's heart, indifferent to human affairs, its bridges connecting neighborhoods that felt increasingly disconnected by fear and suspicion. The astronomical clock in Old Town Square continued its mechanical performance every hour, a reminder of continuity and precision in a world that felt increasingly unpredictable. In this environment, relationships took on heightened significance. Family connections, friendships formed before the occupation, the networks of trust that allowed people to speak candidly. These became lifelines in a sea of uncertainty. Marie maintained such connections, though the documentary evidence of her social world is fragmentary, pieced together from later testimonies and the limited records that survived the war. What emerges is a portrait of someone embedded in the ordinary social structures of urban life. Colleagues at work, family members in Prague and perhaps beyond, the casual acquaintances formed through repeated encounters in a neighborhood or on a familiar tram route. The mechanisms of occupation were both visible and invisible. German soldiers and officials were a constant presence, a reminder of who held power. But the deeper machinery of control operated through paperwork, through identification requirements, through the thousand small regulations that govern movement and activity. Marie, like everyone else, carried the documents necessary to prove her right to exist in particular spaces, to work, to move through the city. The bureaucracy of occupation created paper trails that would later become crucial to understanding what happened, but in the moment, they were simply part of the texture of daily survival. As April 1943 approached, there was nothing in Marie's life that obviously suggested impending catastrophe. She continued her work, maintained her routines, navigated the same streets she had known since childhood. The war ground on. News filtered through from distant fronts, the Eastern Front where German forces were locked in brutal combat with the Soviet Union, the ongoing Allied bombing campaigns in Germany, the slowly building pressure that would eventually crack the Nazi Empire. But for individuals living under occupation, the war was both everywhere and nowhere, a constant background condition that shaped everything while remaining largely out of their control. The specific circumstances of late April 1943 in Prague included tensions that would not become fully clear until later. The assassination of Reinhard Heydrich, the brutal Reich protector, had occurred the previous year in May 1942, leading to savage reprisals including the complete destruction of the village of Lidice. The trauma of that event still resonated through Czech society, a demonstration of the arbitrary and overwhelming violence that occupation could unleash. The resistance movements, both the government in exile operating from London and the various underground networks within the protectorate, continued their dangerous work, always aware that discovery meant torture and death. Into this complex, fearful, carefully balanced world, Marie Fikakova walked on the morning of April 27, 1943. She left her apartment as she had done countless times before, stepping into streets that must have seemed utterly familiar. The spring weather would have been evident, trees budding, the particular quality of morning light that comes with longer days, the sounds and smells of a city waking to another day of occupation. She had appointments to keep, perhaps, or simply work to attend. The mundane motivations that structure our days. And then, somewhere between her door and her destination, Marie Fikakova disappeared from the visible world. No struggle witnessed by reliable sources, no body discovered, no clear explanation. Simply an absence where a presence had been, a silence where a life had been unfolding. In a city already full of disappearances, this might have passed almost unnoticed, except that someone cared enough to ask questions, to notice when she failed to return, to begin the process of searching that would ultimately reveal nothing conclusive at all. Chapter 2. The Unraveling. The first hours after someone fails to appear where they should be are filled with ordinary explanations. Perhaps they're running late. Perhaps they misunderstood the arrangements. Perhaps they've encountered some minor emergency that prevented them from sending word. This is the space where worry has not yet crystallized into fear, where the mind still offers reassuring possibilities rather than confronting darker alternatives. For those who expected Marie Fikakova on April 27, 1943, this period of reasonable doubt began to erode as the day progressed and she simply did not materialize. The exact sequence of who noticed her absence first, and when concern escalated to active searching, is obscured by time and the fragmentary nature of the records. What we know is that by the following day, people who knew Marie understood that something was wrong. A young woman maintaining regular employment and social connections does not simply vanish without explanation unless something has prevented her return. In ordinary times, this would have prompted straightforward investigation, checking with family, with friends, with her workplace, retracing her likely movements. But these were not ordinary times, and the mechanisms for finding missing persons operated under very different conditions during the Nazi occupation. The Protectorate Police, nominally Czech but operating under German oversight and control, represented a complicated authority. Reporting someone missing meant engaging with an apparatus that served the occupation, that could not necessarily be trusted to act in the best interests of Czech civilians. Yet the alternative, attempting to search privately without official help, was equally problematic in a city where unauthorized activity drew suspicion and where ordinary citizens lacked the resources and authority to conduct effective investigations. This placed Marie's family and friends in an impossible position, forced to navigate between the dangers of official involvement and the inadequacy of private efforts. When Marie was formally reported missing, and the documentation suggests this occurred within days of her disappearance, the investigation that followed was shaped by the priorities and assumptions of occupation authorities. German officials were primarily concerned with security threats, with resistance activity, with anything that might undermine their control. A missing Czech woman might be a victim of crime, but she might also be someone who had gone into hiding, joined partisan groups, or fled to avoid some obligation. The investigation, such as it was, proceeded from these premises rather than from any genuine concern for Marie as an individual with rights and dignity. The search for Marie Fikakova unfolded across multiple layers of Prague's occupied landscape. Her apartment was examined. Whether thoroughly or perfunctorily, we cannot know with certainty. Her belongings remained, suggesting that whatever had happened had not been planned as a deliberate departure. There was no evidence of struggle within her living space, no signs of forced entry or violence that might indicate she had been attacked at home. This narrowed the geography of her disappearance to somewhere between her residence and wherever she had been going that morning, a distance that could have been short or substantial depending on her intended destination. Interviews were conducted with people who knew her. Colleagues at her workplace were questioned about her behavior in the days before she vanished, about whether she had seemed troubled or mentioned plans to go anywhere. Family members were asked about her relationships, her habits, her state of mind. Friends were pressed for information about any difficulties she might have been facing, any enemies she might have had, any involvement in activities that could have made her a target. These interviews produced what such inquiries usually do: a collection of fragmentary observations that painted a picture of normalcy disrupted, but offered no clear explanation for the disruption. The investigation also confronted the particular challenges of wartime Prague. The city's population was not stable. People moved for work, evacuated from bombed areas, fled before arrests, were deported or conscripted. Documentation was simultaneously more extensive and less reliable than in peacetime. The occupation authorities maintained elaborate systems of registration and identification, but these could be circumvented by those with sufficient motivation and resources. The underground resistance maintained its own networks of safe houses and false identities. Jews in hiding lived in attics and cellars, dependent on Gentile protectors who themselves lived in constant fear of discovery. A person could disappear into this landscape deliberately or be swallowed by it against their will. As days stretched into weeks without any trace of Marie, the possibilities multiplied. She could have been arrested by the Gestapo for real or imagined offenses. The Nazi secret police operated with complete impunity, taking people for interrogation who sometimes never re-emerged. She could have been caught in a random sweep, the kind of mass arrest that targeted specific populations or simply grabbed people from the streets to fill quotas for labor deployment. She could have been the victim of ordinary criminal violence, killed for reasons having nothing to do with politics or war, her body hidden somewhere in or outside the city. She could have been taken by someone who knew her, for reasons personal rather than political. Each theory had its plausibility, and none could be definitively eliminated. The emotional toll on those who loved Marie is largely unrecorded, but we can extrapolate from what we understand of human grief and helplessness. Not knowing is its own particular torment, more corrosive in some ways than confirmed loss. Confirmed death allows for mourning, for ritual, for the gradual process of acceptance. Disappearance allows for none of these things. It leaves people suspended in uncertainty, alternating between hope and despair, unable to fully grieve or fully let go. For Marie's family, every knock on the door might bring news, good or terrible. Every rumor about discovered bodies or prisoner releases had to be investigated. The not knowing became a daily burden, a weight that grew heavier with time rather than lighter. The broader context of 1943 provided little encouragement for hopes of safe return. By this point in the war, the systematic nature of Nazi atrocities was becoming harder to ignore, even if the full scope remained hidden. The deportation trains leaving Prague for their Scienstadt and points east had been running for over a year. The reprisals after Heydrich's assassination had demonstrated the regime's capacity for wholesale slaughter. The ongoing war on the Eastern Front, with its astronomical casualty counts, had normalized death on a scale previously unimaginable. Individual lives had become statistical entries, valued or discarded based on their utility to the war machine. Yet the investigation continued, at least nominally. Files were maintained, such as they were. Reports were filed documenting the lack of progress. The bureaucracy of the occupation, whatever its other characteristics, was thorough in its record-keeping. This would later prove both invaluable and frustrating to those trying to understand what had happened. Invaluable because documents survived when witnesses did not. Frustrating because the documents revealed the limitations of the inquiry rather than its successes. The paper trail showed that Marie Fikakova was noted as missing, that inquiries were made, that no definitive answers were found. Beyond that, the official record largely falls silent. In the absence of official answers, unofficial theories proliferated. This is the nature of unexplained disappearances. They become vessels into which people pour their fears and suspicions about the world they inhabit. Some believed Marie had been taken by the Gestapo, that she must have been involved in something that attracted their attention, that she was somewhere in the prison system or already dead. Others thought she might have fled deliberately, escaping some danger unknown to even her closest family. Some suggested ordinary crime, a chance encounter with violence that had nothing to do with the occupation. Each theory reflected something about the person advancing it, their understanding of how the world worked and what dangers were most pressing. The physical search for Marie expanded beyond Prague itself. Inquiries were sent to surrounding areas, to smaller towns and villages where someone fleeing the city might have sought refuge. Hospitals and morgues were checked for unidentified women matching her description. The grim work of examining bodies recovered from the river or found in rural areas became part of the process, though none proved to be Marie. The systematic nature of these efforts varied. Some were thorough, others perfunctory, depending on who was conducting them and what resources were available. The war had stretched every institution beyond its capacity, and missing persons investigations competed with thousands of other demands for attention. By the summer of 1943, the trail had grown cold. Marie Fikakova had been missing for months, and the likelihood of finding her alive diminished with each passing week. The investigation, never particularly robust, had largely stalled. Those searching for her faced the reality that barring some unexpected break, a witness coming forward, a body being discovered, Marie herself reappearing, there might never be definitive answers. This was perhaps the cruelest aspect of the situation. Not just the loss itself, but the absence of certainty, the inability to close the circle of her story with any kind of conclusion. The machinery of occupation continued regardless. Prague went on being occupied. Its citizens continued navigating the daily requirements of life under German control. The war ground forward toward its distant conclusion. Individual tragedies, however profound to those directly affected, became mere footnotes to larger historical processes. Marie's disappearance, devastating to those who knew her, barely registered in the broader accounting of the war's toll. This is the nature of such times. They produce losses too numerous to individually commemorate, leaving behind only the aggregate weight of suffering. By autumn 1943, Marie Fikakova had been missing for half a year. The changing seasons marked time in a way that felt both natural and cruel. Spring had given way to summer, summer to fall, and with each transition the world moved further from the moment of her disappearance. For those who continued to search for answers, this passage of time represented both a diminishment of hope and a deepening of commitment. The longer someone remains missing, the more their absence becomes integrated into the lives of those left behind, a permanent wound that sometimes scars over but never fully heals. The investigation, such as it remained, had settled into a pattern of periodic reviews that yielded nothing new. Files were maintained, updated with the notation that no progress had been made, then returned to whatever archive housed such records. The bureaucratic apparatus of the Protectorate had procedures for handling missing persons cases, and those procedures were followed with the mechanical precision that characterized German administration. But procedures are not the same as genuine effort, and the distinction mattered enormously to anyone who understood that the systems supposedly searching for Marie were simultaneously operating the mechanisms of oppression that might well have claimed her. One possibility that gained credence over time was that Marie had been caught up in one of the labor conscription schemes that increasingly characterized the later war years. The Nazi war economy ran on forced labor. Millions of people from occupied territories were compelled to work in German factories, farms, and infrastructure projects, kept there by threat and force rather than any voluntary contract. Women as well as men were subject to these deportations, pulled from their homes and sent to destinations throughout the Reich. The documentation for such transports was often incomplete or deliberately obscured, making it difficult to track individual fates. If Marie had been taken in this way, she could be anywhere in Germany or German-occupied territory, laboring under conditions that ranged from merely harsh to lethal, with no means of communication with her family. This theory had both logic and horror on its side. It explained the sudden disappearance without requiring the assumption of death. It accounted for the lack of body or evidence of struggle. It fit with what was known about German occupation policies and their increasing demands for labor as the war consumed more and more resources. But it also meant imagining Marie in circumstances of profound degradation and danger. Underfed, overworked, possibly abused, cut off from everyone she knew and loved, surviving if she was fortunate, perishing if she was not. For her family, this possibility offered a terrible kind of hope. She might be alive, which meant there was something to hope for, but she was suffering, which made the hoping itself a form of torment. Alternative theories persisted alongside this one. The possibility of political arrest remained viable. The Gestapo maintained extensive networks of informers and conducted sweeps targeting suspected resistance sympathizers with or without substantive evidence. Being in the wrong place at the wrong time, knowing someone who was arrested, having family connections that looked suspicious under occupation logic. Any of these could result in detention. The Gestapo's practices of interrogation and detention were deliberately opaque, designed to maximize fear through uncertainty. People taken by the secret police sometimes re-emerged, sometimes were transferred to concentration camps, sometimes simply disappeared into a system that left no reliable records of their fate. There was also the ongoing possibility of ordinary criminality unrelated to the occupation. Women were vulnerable to sexual violence, to robbery that escalated into murder, to the simple brutality that some humans inflict on others given opportunity and absence of consequences. Prague, like any city, had its dangerous spaces and dangerous individuals. The war and occupation had arguably made such dangers worse by weakening social structures and normalizing violence. If Marie had encountered such danger, her body might be anywhere. Buried in a cellar, disposed of in the river, hidden in one of the many bombed or abandoned structures that increasingly dotted the urban landscape. As 1943 gave way to 1944, the war itself began to shift in ways that would ultimately prove decisive. The Soviets were pushing German forces back across the Eastern Front. The Western Allies were preparing for the invasion of France. The bombing of German cities intensified, turning urban centers into rubble. The Nazi regime, sensing the approaching end, became simultaneously more brutal and more chaotic in its operations. For occupied populations throughout Europe, this created a paradoxical situation. Liberation seemed increasingly possible, even likely eventually, but the immediate present grew more dangerous as the occupation forces lashed out with increasing desperation. For Marie's family, these larger historical movements offered both hope and renewed anxiety. Liberation might bring answers. Captured German records might reveal what had happened. Prisoners might be released and return home. The truth might emerge from the fog of occupation. But liberation also seemed impossibly distant when measured against daily suffering, and there was no guarantee that Marie would survive to see it even if she was alive somewhere in the German forced labor system. The mathematics of hope during this period were brutal. Too much optimism felt like denial of likely reality, but too little felt like betrayal of the missing person who might still need to be believed in and waited for. The physical evidence of Marie's existence began to take on new significance as time passed. Photographs became precious in a different way. No longer simply mementos, but possibly the only images that would ever exist of her, the only way future generations might know what she looked like. Personal belongings remaining in her apartment became almost relics, objects that she had touched and used, made meaningful by their connection to someone who was no longer present to claim them. This transformation of the ordinary into the significant is common in cases of disappearance. Everyday objects becoming invested with emotional weight they were never meant to carry. The documentation of Marie's case, scattered across various administrative files, presented its own kind of portrait. Here was a life reduced to bureaucratic notation. Birth date, last known address, physical description, date of disappearance, summary of investigative efforts. The file represented both preservation and reduction. It meant Marie was remembered officially, but that memory was thin, failing to capture anything of who she had actually been beyond the basic facts needed for identification. This is one of the tragedies of such cases. The person becomes a case number, a file, a statistic, even as those who love them struggle to preserve the fullness of their humanity against this bureaucratic flattening. By 1945, with the war in its final stages, the situation across occupied Europe had deteriorated into chaos. The German administration was collapsing, records were being destroyed or lost, populations were in flux as people fled advancing armies or were moved by retreating occupiers. The carefully maintained systems of documentation that had characterized Nazi bureaucracy were breaking down. For someone trying to trace a missing person, this created enormous difficulties. The very records that might have held answers were disappearing into the chaos, burned or abandoned or simply lost in the general disorder of collapse. Prague itself was liberated in May 1945, first by Czech resistance fighters who rose up against the German garrison. then by Soviet forces who entered the city as the uprising was still underway. The fighting left parts of the city damaged, killed hundreds, and created the conditions for revenge violence against German civilians. In the immediate aftermath, the focus was on basic survival, on establishing new governance, on dealing with the tens of thousands of displaced persons and the immediate humanitarian crisis. Individual missing persons cases, even those that had been ongoing for years, had to compete for attention with more pressing immediate needs. But liberation also meant access to captured German records, however incomplete. It meant the possibility of interviewing former occupation officials, of tracking down former Gestapo members, of finding documentation in German archives that might reveal fates of missing persons. It meant, potentially, the return of forced laborers from German territory, survivors of concentration camps, prisoners of war. For families of the missing, the months following liberation were filled with frantic activity. Checking lists of survivors, examining photographs of liberated prisoners, searching through records for any mention of their loved ones. For those searching for Marie Fikakova, this period brought no resolution. She did not appear among the survivors returning from German forced labor camps. She was not found in the Theresienstadt ghetto when it was liberated, nor in the few records that survived from the deportation transports to Auschwitz and other death camps. Her name did not appear in Gestapo records that were captured intact. There was no documentation of her arrest, no record of her death, no evidence that clearly explained what had happened to her after she left her apartment on April 27, 1943. The liberation, for all the hope it had represented, brought only the confirmation of continued uncertainty. The years following the war brought Czechoslovakia a series of new transformations. A brief period of restored independence, then the communist coup of 1948, then decades of Soviet domination. Each political shift brought its own priorities and its own attitudes toward the past. The missing and the dead from the war years were commemorated, but in ways that served contemporary political purposes. Victims of fascism were honored in official ceremonies, but the complexity of individual cases often disappeared into simplified narratives of resistance and martyrdom. Marie Fikakova's disappearance, never resolved, became part of this complicated landscape of remembrance. Her family continued searching for answers long after the immediate post-war period ended. This is characteristic of families of the disappeared. The searching becomes a form of fidelity, a refusal to abandon the missing person to oblivion. They checked with organizations established to trace missing persons, submitted inquiries to archives as they were opened, followed leads however unpromising they seemed. Each new opening of previously sealed records, whether German archives, Soviet files, or Czech secret police documents, brought renewed hope that something might finally explain what had happened. Each time, the hope was disappointed. The practical reality of living with such unresolved loss is difficult to capture in historical narrative. For Marie's parents, if they survived the war and its aftermath, every significant life event was marked by her absence. Holidays, family celebrations, ordinary daily moments, all were shadowed by not knowing. For siblings, if she had them, there was the strange experience of growing older than the sister who had disappeared, of reaching ages she never achieved, of living lives she never got to live. For friends, there was the gradual fading of vivid memory into something more general, the specific details of her personality becoming harder to recall as years passed, replaced by the fact of her absence. The physical spaces that Marie had inhabited underwent their own transformations. Her apartment was eventually occupied by others. Housing was too scarce in post-war Prague to leave spaces empty for those who might never return. The streets she had walked were rebuilt, were damaged, gradually modernized, changed by the passage of decades. The city she had known, already transformed by occupation, continued changing under communist rule and then after the Velvet Revolution of 1989. The Prague of the 21st century bears little visible resemblance to the city of 1943, though the same river flows through it and some of the same buildings still stand. Various theories about Marie's fate continued to circulate among those who maintained interest in her case. Some believed she had been killed relatively quickly after her disappearance, either by German authorities who left no record or by criminal violence that went undetected. Others held to the possibility that she had been taken for forced labor and died somewhere in Germany during the final chaotic months of the war, perhaps in Allied bombing raids, perhaps from disease or starvation, her death unrecorded in the general catastrophe of 1945. A few maintained hope that she had somehow survived and been unable to return, perhaps suffering amnesia, perhaps choosing for reasons unknown not to reclaim her identity, perhaps held somewhere beyond reach of those searching for her. The broader historical research into the Nazi occupation of Czechoslovakia has continued in the decades since the war, producing extensive documentation of the period's atrocities and operations. We know with terrible precision how many people were killed at Lidice, how many Czech Jews were deported and murdered, how the resistance networks operated and were ultimately crushed or driven underground. We have statistics on forced labor, on political arrests, on the various mechanisms of control and violence that characterized occupation. But this knowledge, valuable as it is for historical understanding, offers little help with individual cases where the evidentiary trail simply ends without explanation. Marie's case is unfortunately not unique. There are thousands of similar disappearances from occupied Europe, people who vanished into the machinery of war and occupation, leaving no clear trail of what became of them. Some were certainly murdered, their bodies disposed of in ways that prevented identification or discovery. Some died in circumstances that went unrecorded in the chaos of wartime. Some ended up in unmarked graves, their identities lost. The scale of the war's violence was such that individual fates often became impossible to trace with certainty, particularly for people who were not prominent enough to attract sustained investigative attention. The question of how to remember such cases, how to honor lives that ended in unknown circumstances, remains challenging. Marie Fikakova never received a funeral because there was no body to bury. She never received official confirmation of death because there was no proof she had died. She exists in a liminal state in the historical record, gone but not officially dead, missing but never found. This creates particular difficulties for commemoration. Memorials to victims of the Nazi occupation can include her only by inference, as one of the many whose fates remain uncertain. Her name does not appear on most lists because the criteria for inclusion typically require evidence of death that her case never provided. For historical purposes, Marie's disappearance serves as a reminder of the limitations of documentation and the persistence of uncertainty, even in well-documented periods. The Nazi occupation of Prague generated enormous amounts of paperwork. The German administration was notoriously bureaucratic, maintaining detailed records of their operations. Yet even this extensive documentation has gaps, areas where individual fates slip through without leaving recoverable traces. This should make us appropriately humble about historical claims to comprehensive knowledge, particularly regarding individual experiences within larger events. The case also raises questions about what we owe to the missing and to their families. The searches that continued for years after Marie's disappearance were driven by love and by the human need for answers, but they were also acts of resistance against erasure. To keep searching, to keep asking questions, to refuse to let someone be forgotten. These are ways of asserting that individual lives matter, that people cannot simply be made to disappear without consequence or acknowledgement. In this sense, the continued interest in Marie's case, however modest, represents a form of memorial. Modern investigative techniques offer some hope for resolving old cases. DNA analysis can potentially identify remains that were buried without identification. Digital archives make it possible to search through documents that were previously inaccessible. Collaborative international efforts to trace victims of Nazi persecution have become more sophisticated and comprehensive. Yet for cases like Marie's, where there is no body to test, no definitive records to discover, even these advances may not be sufficient. The trail that went cold in 1943 has not grown warmer with time, and the people who might have offered testimony, who might have seen something, known something, are themselves gone now. What remains is a story defined by its lack of conclusion, by the questions that persist in the absence of answers. What happened to Marie Fikakova after she left her apartment on April 27, 1943? Where did she go, or where was she taken? Did death come quickly, or did she endure suffering before the end? Was there a moment when she thought of home, of the people searching for her, of the life she had expected to live? We cannot know. The silence that surrounds her disappearance has never been broken by definitive evidence, only by speculation and hope and grief. Her story, incomplete as it is, reminds us that history is not just the narratives we can fully document and explain. It is also the absences, the gaps, the questions that remain unanswered despite our best efforts. It is the individual lives that intersected with historical forces too large and chaotic to be fully mapped or understood. Marie Fikakova was one person among millions affected by the Second World War, but her disappearance represents something more than a statistical entry in the war's toll. It represents the irreducible mystery of individual fate, the way a single life can vanish leaving barely a trace, and the enduring human need to remember and to search for answers even when answers refuse to come. The photograph that survives of Marie, if indeed one does survive in some family archive or historical collection, shows a young woman whose future was still unwritten when the image was captured. She could not have known what was coming, could not have imagined that her name would eventually be associated primarily with her disappearance rather than with her life. She was simply herself, living in difficult times, navigating challenges as best she could, carrying hopes and worries and plans that seemed important in the moment. That person, that life with all its ordinary complexity, is what was lost when she disappeared. The historical record preserves the fact of the loss but cannot fully restore what was taken. In the end, we are left with what we have: the basic facts of Marie Fikakova's existence and disappearance, the fragmentary records of the search that followed, the broader historical context that makes her fate tragically plausible in multiple ways. We are left with the knowledge that she mattered to people who loved her, that her absence caused suffering that rippled through lives and years. We are left with the responsibility to remember, even when memory cannot provide the closure that we and her family would have wished for. And we are left with the questions, the unresolved mysteries that persist as reminders of how much remains unknowable about the past. How many stories ended without proper conclusions? How many lives were interrupted and never resumed? The silence that settled over Prague when Marie Fikakova vanished has never fully lifted. It persists in the gaps in the historical record, in the absence of answers, in the space between what we know and what we wish we could know. That silence is itself a kind of testimony, a reminder of what was lost and what remains lost despite all the years and all the searching. It asks us to sit with uncertainty, to acknowledge the limits of our knowledge, and to remember with whatever incomplete information we have. In a world that often demands clear answers and definite conclusions, Marie's story offers something different. An invitation to honor a life even when we cannot fully explain its end, to hold space for mystery while maintaining our commitment to truth and memory. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and subscribe, so you never miss the next true crime story to help you unwind. Now, let's get into our final story. Story 4. The Smiling Widow. The Nanny Doss story. There's a photograph that survived the decades. A woman in her middle years, round-faced and pleasant, wearing cat-eye glasses and a smile that reached her eyes. She looked like someone who might bring you pie, who might wave from a porch in a cotton dress on a summer afternoon. The kind of woman you'd trust with your children, your secrets, your life. And that was precisely the problem. Because behind that smile, behind the carefully maintained appearance of orderly domesticity, Nanny Doss carried something that most of her neighbors in the quiet towns of Alabama and Oklahoma and Kansas could never have imagined. She carried patience. She carried planning. And she carried, for more than 3 decades, a method so consistent and so well hidden that even when suspicion finally arrived, it came almost by accident. This isn't a story about sudden violence or dramatic confrontation. It's about something quieter and perhaps more disturbing, the slow, methodical work of someone who understood that normalcy itself could be a perfect disguise. It's about how the ordinary rhythms of American life in the mid-20th century, with its assumptions about women and marriage and family, created spaces where certain kinds of cruelty could flourish unnoticed. And it's about how a woman who read romance magazines and baked cakes and complained about her husband's being difficult became one of the most prolific serial killers in American history, all while maintaining that same pleasant smile. Her name was Nancy Hazel, though the world would come to know her as Nanny Doss. And by the time anyone understood what she had done, at least 11 people were dead, possibly more. The exact number, even now, remains uncertain. Nancy Hazel was born in 1905 in Blue Mountain, Alabama, a small community tucked into the hills where the Appalachian Range begins its slow descent toward the coastal plain. It was a world of tenant farming and hard work, of social structures that offered little room for deviation, particularly for girls. Her father, James Hazel, worked as a farmer and, by all accounts, ruled his household with rigid authority. Nancy was one of 5 children, and the family moved frequently, following work and opportunity as it appeared and disappeared across the rural South. The early 20th century in this part of Alabama was defined by isolation and limitation. Towns were small, opportunities were scarce. For young women especially, the future was largely predetermined. Marriage, children, the maintenance of a household. Education was secondary. Independence was not really contemplated. James Hazel enforced these expectations with particular strictness. He didn't allow his daughters to attend social events or wear makeup. He controlled their movements and their friendships. Nancy later claimed that a childhood accident, falling and hitting her head while the family traveled by wagon, had caused headaches and mood changes that persisted throughout her life. Whether this was true or a later attempt to construct a narrative that might explain what came after is impossible to verify. What's certain is that Nancy's childhood offered little joy and less freedom. At 16, she met a man named Charles Braggs. He worked at a local factory, and he represented something that must have seemed, to a teenage girl trapped under her father's control, like escape. They married quickly in 1921, and Nancy became a wife before she'd had much chance to be anything else. They moved to Jacksonville, Alabama, and then to various other towns as Charles sought work. The marriage was not happy. Charles drank. He stayed out late. He was, according to later accounts, unfaithful. But these problems, while real, were also common enough in that time and place. Many marriages survived worse. Nancy had 4 daughters between 1923 and 1927, and for a time, the family settled into a pattern that looked, from the outside, like countless other struggling working-class families in Depression-era America. But something was already changing beneath the surface. In 1927, 2 of Nancy's daughters died within months of each other. The causes given were food poisoning in one case, and what was described as asphyxiation in the other, though the details remained vague. Infant mortality was tragically common in the 1920s, especially in poorer communities with limited medical care. No one investigated. No one asked questions. Grief was acknowledged, and then the family moved on, as families did. Nancy's remaining 2 daughters survived to adulthood, though their childhoods were marked by instability. Charles continued drinking. Nancy grew increasingly dissatisfied. She began reading romance magazines obsessively. True Romance, True Confessions, publications that promised passionate love and dramatic destiny. She started placing personal ads in the Lonely Hearts columns, corresponding with men while still married, imagining different lives. In 1928, Nancy's house burned down. Charles was away at the time. The family lost nearly everything. Then, as if fortune had briefly turned, Nancy received a small insurance payout. Not long after, Charles left, taking one of their daughters with him, apparently convinced that staying meant some kind of danger he couldn't quite name. He later claimed he'd suspected Nancy of trying to poison him, though he never filed charges or made formal accusations. He simply disappeared from her life, taking his suspicions with him. For Nancy, this departure was not a tragedy. It was an opportunity. By the early 1930s, she was alone with one daughter, Melvina. She had some money, and she had learned something important. That, under the right circumstances, death could look natural. That questions weren't always asked. That moving on was something people accepted, even expected. The foundation was laid, though no one knew it yet. Nancy Hazel Braggs, now in her late 20s, began to see the world differently than most people did. She saw vulnerability where others saw family. She saw opportunity where others saw obligation. And she began, slowly and carefully, to act on that vision. In 1929, Nancy met Frank Harrelson through a Lonely Hearts column. He was a factory worker with a drinking problem, much like Charles had been, but Nancy seemed undeterred by the repetition. They married quickly, and she moved with her daughter Melvina to his home in Jacksonville, Alabama. Frank's 2 daughters from a previous marriage also lived with them, creating a blended household that looked, to neighbors, like a standard if somewhat chaotic family. What happened inside that home was less visible. Frank drank heavily and, according to later accounts, became abusive. The marriage was volatile. But Nancy stayed, as many women in her position did, constrained by economics and social expectation. She continued reading her romance magazines, continued dreaming of something different, and in the background of this unhappy marriage, people began to die. In 1945, Frank's teenage daughter from his first marriage died suddenly. The cause was listed as stomach distress, something that had come on quickly and couldn't be treated effectively. It was tragic, but such things happened. A few months later, Nancy's own grandson, Melvina's infant son, died under similar circumstances while in Nancy's care. Again, the death was attributed to natural causes, asphyxiation this time, possibly related to the child's small size and fragile health. Melvina grieved but didn't question. Death in infancy was still common enough not to raise immediate suspicion, especially in working-class families without regular access to doctors. In September of 1945, Frank Harrelson came home drunk one evening and ate a meal Nancy had prepared. Within hours, he was violently ill. He died that same night. The death was attributed to acute alcohol poisoning, a conclusion that seemed entirely plausible given Frank's well-known drinking habits. Nancy collected a life insurance policy, played the grieving widow at the funeral, and began scanning the Lonely Hearts columns again before Frank was even buried a month. The pattern was forming, though no one saw it as a pattern yet. Each death stood alone, explained by circumstance. A frail infant, a sick teenager, an alcoholic man. The connections existed only in Nancy's mind. She didn't wait long. In 1947, Nancy married Arlie Lanning, another man she'd met through correspondence. He was from Lexington, North Carolina, and he seemed initially more stable than her previous husbands. They settled into his home, and for a time things appeared calm. But Arlie had expectations. He wanted a traditional wife, someone who would keep house and defer to him. Nancy complied outwardly, but she continued her magazine subscriptions, her letter writing, her private life of imagined alternatives. When Arlie expressed disapproval, she smiled and nodded and changed nothing. Arlie's house, like Nancy's previous homes, became a place where death arrived without warning. In 1950, Arlie's mother, who lived with them, died suddenly in her sleep. She'd been in reasonable health for her age. The death was attributed to heart failure, something common in elderly women. No autopsy was performed. No investigation was opened. Then, in 1952, Arlie himself died. He'd been complaining of stomach pain, had stopped eating, had grown weak over the course of several days. When he finally collapsed, doctors assumed heart attack or some kind of acute cardiac event. Nancy was appropriately distraught. She collected another insurance payout. And within months, she'd placed another personal ad. What's remarkable, looking back, is how unremarkable it all seemed at the time. Nancy moved from place to place, husband to husband, loss to loss, and at each stop she was simply a woman dealing with the kind of tragedies that befell many families. She attended funerals. She wept. She spoke about God's will and the mysteries of illness. And people believed her because there was no reason not to. She looked like their aunts, their neighbors, their friends. The idea that she might be orchestrating these deaths was so far outside the realm of normal consideration that it simply didn't arise. Even family members who might have noticed the frequency of deaths around Nancy attributed it to bad luck or God's plan, not to human agency. This is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the story. How long and how easily the truth remained hidden, protected not by elaborate deception but by simple, persistent ordinariness. By 1952, Nancy had buried 3 husbands and collected 3 insurance payouts. She'd lost children and grandchildren and in-laws. She'd moved across several states, always starting fresh, always maintaining that same pleasant demeanor. And she was just getting started. Richard Morton seemed different from the others. Nancy met him in 1952 through another Lonely Hearts ad, and he appeared, at first, to be exactly what those romance magazines had promised. Attentive, romantic, well-mannered. He lived in Emporia, Kansas, worked as a salesman, and wrote her long letters full of affection and plans for the future. They married in 1952, and Nancy moved to Kansas with a sense that perhaps this time, finally, things might work out differently. They didn't. Richard was romantic in letters, but in person he was demanding and critical. He didn't like Nancy's magazine subscriptions. He didn't approve of how she spent money. He expected meals at certain times and the house kept a certain way. Within months, the marriage had settled into familiar dissatisfaction. Nancy began corresponding with other men again, keeping the letters hidden, planning her next move. But Richard discovered the letters. There was a confrontation. He threatened to leave, to expose her, to ruin her reputation. For Nancy, this wasn't just an unhappy marriage anymore. It was a problem that needed solving. In October of 1953, Richard Morton died suddenly. He'd been fine that morning, had gone to work, had come home for dinner. Within hours of eating, he became violently ill. He collapsed, vomiting and convulsing. By the time a doctor arrived, Richard was barely conscious. He died before reaching the hospital. The doctor, seeing a middle-aged man who'd suddenly become gravely ill, suspected heart attack or possibly food poisoning. But Richard's death was so sudden, so violent, that something about it didn't quite fit. The doctor suggested an autopsy. Nancy, ever the grieving widow, agreed, confident that she'd covered her tracks as she always had. She was wrong. The autopsy revealed massive amounts of arsenic in Richard's system, enough to kill several men. This wasn't food poisoning. This wasn't a heart attack. This was murder, clear and undeniable. The police were called. Suddenly, the pleasant widow from Alabama was being questioned not as a victim of circumstance, but as a suspect. Nancy remained calm. She smiled. She seemed confused by the accusations. But the evidence was physical and irrefutable. Richard Morton had been poisoned, and Nancy was the only person who'd had the opportunity and the access. As investigators began looking into Nancy's history, the pattern that had been invisible for decades suddenly became horrifyingly clear. For dead husbands, dead children, dead grandchildren, dead in-laws, all with similar symptoms, all unexpected, all followed by insurance claims and quick relocations. Authorities in Alabama, North Carolina, Oklahoma, and Kansas began coordinating. Bodies were exhumed, autopsies were performed, and in case after case, the findings were the same: arsenic. Large quantities of it administered over time. Not all the bodies yielded clear evidence. Some had been buried too long, some had been cremated, but enough did to establish a pattern that was unmistakable. Nancy was arrested in November 1954 in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where she'd moved after Richard's death to stay with her daughter Melvina. She was charged with Richard Morton's murder, and as investigations continued, evidence mounted connecting her to at least 11 deaths, possibly more. The exact number would never be fully determined. Some bodies couldn't be exhumed. Some deaths were too old to prosecute. But what emerged was a portrait of methodical, patient killing that had spanned more than 30 years. Nancy Doss, as the press began calling her, using her fifth husband's surname, had been murdering family members since at least the 1920s, using rat poison and arsenic-based products that were readily available in hardware stores and farms across America. She'd killed for insurance money, for freedom from unhappy marriages, and sometimes it seemed simply because someone had become inconvenient. The trial, when it finally began in 1955, was a media sensation. Newspapers across the country ran headlines about the giggling granny and the lonely hearts killer. The nicknames were reductive and sensational, but they captured something about Nancy that disturbed people. She seemed cheerful. Even when being questioned about murders, even when confronted with evidence of bodies and poison and calculated deception, Nancy Doss smiled. She was polite. She was cooperative. And eventually she confessed. The confession itself was remarkable. Nancy admitted to killing 4 of her husbands: Frank Harrelson, Arlie Lanning, Richard Morton, and her 5th husband, Samuel Doss, whom she'd married in 1953 between Richard and her arrest, and who had died within months of the marriage under circumstances identical to the others. She claimed the murders were motivated by unhappiness in her marriages. She said the men had been cruel or boring, or had interfered with her television watching and magazine reading. She spoke about the killings almost casually, as if discussing recipes or gardening techniques. When asked why she'd smiled throughout the interrogations, she reportedly said she'd been thinking about how stupid the men had been not to realize what was happening. She did not confess to killing her children, grandchildren, or in-laws, though investigators were convinced she had. Without confessions and with limited physical evidence in those older cases, prosecutors focused on the murders where evidence was strongest. Nancy was ultimately charged with murdering Richard Morton and Samuel Doss. She pleaded guilty to avoid the death penalty, and in June 1955, she was sentenced to life imprisonment. She was 50 years old. The case raised uncomfortable questions that echoed through American society. How had this happened? How had a woman killed repeatedly over decades without anyone noticing? Part of the answer lay in the poison she'd chosen. Arsenic was readily available, used in rat poisons and agricultural products. Its symptoms, stomach pain, vomiting, weakness, mimicked common illnesses. Doctors in the 1930s and 40s, especially in rural areas, rarely ordered autopsies for deaths that seemed to have natural explanations. Insurance companies processed claims without deep investigation. And perhaps most significantly, Nancy Doss didn't fit anyone's image of a killer. She was female, middle-aged, matronly. She baked. She smiled. She went to church. The idea that such a woman could be dangerous was so contrary to social expectations that it created a kind of protective invisibility. There was also the question of psychology. What created Nancy Doss? Various experts offered theories. Some pointed to her oppressive childhood, her controlling father, her early head injury. Some suggested she was a psychopath, incapable of empathy or genuine emotional connection. Others thought she might have had a personality disorder that made her see people as obstacles rather than humans. Nancy herself offered little insight. In prison interviews, she remained pleasant and unconcerned. She read her romance magazines. She seemed content. When asked if she felt remorse, she didn't really answer. She just smiled. Nancy Doss died in prison in 1965, at age 60 of leukemia. She never faced trial for most of the murders investigators believed she'd committed. The true number of her victims remains unknown. Official counts list 11, but some researchers have suggested the number could be as high as 12 or more, including siblings who died in childhood under suspicious circumstances. Each unanswered question stands as a small monument to lives that ended quietly, unnoticed, attributed to bad luck or God's will when they might have been something much darker. The legacy of Nancy Doss lingers in uncomfortable ways. Her case helped change how authorities investigate deaths in domestic settings. It contributed to increased scrutiny of insurance claims involving multiple deaths in single families. It challenged assumptions about who could be dangerous and what danger might look like. But perhaps most significantly, it remains a reminder of how ordinary evil can appear, how it can hide in plain sight, protected by nothing more than a smile and the human tendency to trust what seems familiar. In the end, Nancy Doss was not a monster from nightmares. She was something more disturbing. A woman who looked like everyone's grandmother and killed with the same patience and planning that others might bring to knitting or canning vegetables. And that, more than any sensational detail, is what makes her story continue to unsettle more than half a century after her crimes were discovered. The question she leaves behind isn't just how she did it, but how many others might be doing it still, hidden behind ordinariness, waiting just out of sight? Thank you for watching and being part of this dive into the dark and fascinating stories that keep us all on edge. If you enjoyed the ride, remember to like, subscribe, and share with others who crave a good mystery. Tell us where you're watching from. I love knowing where in the world our true crime family is tuning in. Your presence means a lot. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep digging into the shadows where truth and mystery meet.